Another episode of 3D Printing News Unpeeled, thanks to 3dprint.com. Today we've got a couple of news items for you. First is, well, it's a curious little news item. So there was an item on China's national TV channel, CCTV, that was widely disseminated throughout Chinese news media and farther afield than that. And essentially, the only thing the news item says is that China's AVIC, which is one of their national champions, if you will, in aviation, responsible for a lot of Chinese fighters, is extensively using 3D printing in its fighter jets. That's kind of all it says. That's all the news item. And given the fact how wide it's spread, given the fact how little content is in it, that's very curious. And the other thing is that why is China's leadership so intent on releasing this bit of news at this moment? I'm sure you can all have a number of theories. And on top of that, what's so relevant about this? So the news item itself is that essentially it says Dr. Li Xiaodan is a member of the Luoyang Youth Commando at Shenyang Aircraft Company. And he's basically saying that they use 3D printing extensively in aircraft. Now, we know this already. We know this for a fact already for many years that China has been using DED for structural elements, for things like wind spars and stuff like that. And they've been extensively using padded bed fusion for a lot of aircraft components as well, as has the United States of America. And China has been known to spend an awful lot of money stimulating its industry to make 3D printers so that it has the capacity to do this, and has been spending an awful lot of money, quite semi-publicly, if you will, in 5-year plans and the like, in trying to create super alloys and create other intermetallics and other kind of high-performance materials for 3D printing. So this isn't really a surprise, but it's notable because, well, companies like AVIC don't really kind of tend to do a lot of press about this kind of stuff. They don't really tend to get a lot of national press. So it seems to be this AVIC, or Shenzhen Aircraft Company, that's the one quoted, is a part of AVIC. And it seems to be that there's quite a bit of national prestige and points to be scored nationally within China in using 3D printing extensively in things like jet aircraft. So that's a good thing for 3D printing. It means that there's likely to be more stimulus in 3D printing. It means likely that it's a good signal to send to the world that China is leading in 3D printing. And I don't know, it's one of these curious little things where it's like it's a news item that's being spread wide while it's not really a news item, because we know this already and they've said this already before. So I thought this was a very curious thing to think about, why China would be taking this so seriously now. The next thing is a news item. I think it comes from Thomas Rady, and he's writes for a thing called Bell of Lost Souls, which is a kind of a Warhammer 40K specific blog news source. Now, reading this just got me to thinking a lot about Warhammer 40K, and other kind of tabletop games and 3D printing, which we'll talk about in a bit. But what I found interesting about this is that we got Thomas's own kind of view on Warhammer players. So Warhammer is a game that uses tabletop action figures that you buy for a lot of money, that you usually paint yourself, put a lot of effort in them, make them look as beautiful as you can. And then you have kind of it's a mix between like a fantasy world and kind of a combat type game with dice and stuff. Now, so 3D printing has been used, and a lot of times there have been discussions about if this is allowed, if this is okay, is it to the detriment of Warhammer because they're not selling these tabletop elements because they're being printed, or is it to the does it aid them because it helps expand this universe? So what he's saying really is, in this blog post, which I thought was really fascinating, is he wants standards. What he wants is a kind of like, to know that the 3D printed things that are appearing in the games that he's partaking in are of a certain quality, so that it doesn't disturb his experience. Right now, the other thing that he says, I think, is of particular interest, and that is that he thinks that, that the really specific things, such as, for example, a small hand of a particular position with a particular weapon, that could be the kind of, if you will, the killer app. I'm sorry I said that, for 3D printing, where we could have the perfect. Well, there's a quote: "Finding the perfect weapon for your left-handed model." Right. So these really specific endpoints, and we saw this. I tried for many years, like I think about 4, to stimulate the model railway community to make 3D printing their technology of choice. Now, what we saw in that community is they're very critical in the quality, but where it really kind of gained ground the first was a guy called Mitchell Yetten, by the way, who essentially made a lot of stuff like furniture, if you will, little benches, crossing guards, crossing elements, traffic lights, that kind of thing, that wasn't existing in the rest of the model railway community. That just didn't exist, but it added to the realism. That was where the real breakthrough was in that model railway thing. Likewise, maybe these kind of endpoint, kind of like really, really specific models are going to be the breakthrough in the Warcraft community, or the Warhammer community. Now, why I think this is exciting is because, well, I don't really think it's that exciting to augment Warhammer or anything like that. What I do think is exciting is, imagine you are inventing a fantasy world and you want to commercialize this through tabletop gaming. Like, imagine the distribution model you would have by making the files free in the beginning, for example, to spread it, or making people have a subscription where they had access to all the files, they could print it at home, or to give people kind of the option of, in a very low volume, buy these figurines from you or someone else, or from a 3D printing service, right? Now, I know this has been tried again and again by people. There's been some Kickstarters, there's been some people on Thingiverse and all this, but I'm just intrigued at why this hasn't been successful. Why hasn't someone been able to create this big fantasy world of their own making and commercialize it through 3D printing? This tabletop gaming segment is something that's ripe for exploitation of 3D printing. It's ripe to become much more democratized, much bigger, much more interesting, much more kind of like very niche through 3D printing. Everyone could really make their own figurines, or everyone could make really specific figurines from really specific kind of fantasy world. So, the options here are great, but we must remember, and that's the one thing that I think is really fantastic by Thomas Rage's post, is the cheated he felt by the experience ruined by low quality parts. We have to maintain quality, and if we do that, then there could be a big future for us in this tabletop gaming thing. Now, there's another segment that I really think is also ripe for 3D printing growth, and that's the first thing. It's just desktop, more desktop stuff actually, but desktop kind of items like this. Like, if we look at 3D printed parts that are ripe for commercialization using desktop 3D printers, we're often talking about things that are quite rough and have to kind of either be disguised or quite obviously use the layers to their advantage. And this is a good example of this. This is a design office, whatever, called Pearson Lloyd, and they're working with Benem, which is a furniture brand, to use 3D printing PLA objects to make desktop, pencil holders and all sorts of things that you put on your desk and use and all that. So I think I think it's really well designed. This stuff is really, really, the pictures are a little bit, let's say, optimistic, but you can see some of the moire effects and stuff that tell you a little bit more. What we are seeing is that the designers are grappling with this. Designers have been grappling with this more than a decade now. No one's really cracked it, but the potential is huge. They're selling a lot of these things for around 17 to 20 bucks, which, if we know how to print these things at home, you'll know how much money they're making on these. These things look exceptionally good. I think they're really well thought of, but it still hasn't been possible for someone to really reach something that sells millions of items in this area, even though it's very, very ripe for 3D printing, and then the economics are there. So I think it's a great example, but it still is curious that we still haven't been able to crack, such kind of accessible design markets for 3D printing, even though there are really, really good cost advantages we have. And we're a lot of people that can design objects like this, and somehow we're not cracking it. But that's something I think I'll leave you to think about. Hey, thanks a lot for your time today. And my name's Joris Peels. This is another